To get us started tonight, I'm going to give a couple options for people. So a normal thing that we do in the beginning of traditional Buddhist teachings is the teacher would encourage all the students to generate a particular type of motivation for attending and listening and learning these kind of practices. And I would first, if you're new to all of this, just come with whatever intention you came with. If your intention is just to hear what Buddhism's all about or what Namchak's all about, then that's that. But for people who may be already steeped in this tradition, I encourage you, and I will say it in a very traditional way, like the way that Ken Rinpoche would start every teaching. He would say exactly this. He'll say, you should think this is your intention. I'm going to listen to these teachings and then put them into practice so that I might be able to free all beings from suffering and bring them to the state of Buddhahood. And that intention is what we call the mind of bodhicitta. And so bodhicitta translates as the mind of enlightenment. And so the mind of enlightenment is the topic, the overarching topic of which this topic of the six perfections is a subtopic of. And so last month, if any of you attended, Lama Tsomo gave a talk about bodhicitta. And what we're going to be talking about tonight is something that is called the trainings in bodhicitta. So once you have thought about or generated this kind of intention of bodhicitta, which is the intention to free beings from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment, that is the primary motivation in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. Then if that is your intention, then you have to have some way to train. So when we talk about this mind of bodhicitta, we talk about two aspects of bodhicitta. Lama Tsomo talked about this last month, but I'm going to give a quick summary just to kind of set the stage for what we're going to be talking about tonight. And so when we talk about this mind of bodhicitta or the mind of enlightenment, what we're talking about is that intention I just said. And so there are two aspects to that. There's what we call conventional bodhicitta versus ultimate bodhicitta. So the conventional bodhicitta is that intention to wish for the freedom of all sentient beings, to free them from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. Ultimate bodhicitta is actually what it means is the mind that sees or recognizes or realizes the ultimate truth. So that's not really what we're going to be talking about tonight, but I'm going to talk about that in connection with what is a perfection. Like, what does the word paramita even mean? So first of all, when we're talking about this aspirational bodhicitta, conventional bodhicitta, it itself, sorry to get into all these categories and subcategories, but that's the way it goes sometimes, especially in Buddhism. We have a lot of enumerations of phenomena and so forth, the six of this and the four truths and the eightfold noble path and the 16 aspects of the four noble truths and all this kind of stuff. We're not going to get too complicated tonight, but essentially you've got conventional and ultimate bodhicitta. Within conventional bodhicitta, you have aspirational bodhicitta, which itself is just the aspiration, the wish to free sentient beings. Then there's engaged bodhicitta, which means how are we going to actually do something about that? And so for the aspirational bodhicitta, it's often talked about as a commitment that you make towards a result. So what does that mean? It means I'm committing towards the result of freeing beings from suffering and bringing them to the state of enlightenment. So I'm making a commitment towards some far off result. You know, it's a pretty far off result to think I'm going to free all limitless sentient beings from suffering and bring them all to Buddhahood. So then engaged bodhicitta means I'm committing to a cause. I'm committing to the cause that might bring about that result. So I'm committing myself to the practices which would actually enable me to do that, which would actually enable me to bring about that result of the liberation of all sentient beings and the enlightenment of all sentient beings. And that cause is this practice of the six perfections. So we often talk about the trainings in aspirational bodhicitta and the trainings in engaged bodhicitta. So the trainings in aspirational bodhicitta are things like the four immeasurables, equalizing, exchanging self and other. And then the trainings in engaged bodhicitta, primarily when we talk about that, we talk about the six perfections. Also in many texts, they'll talk about methods for generating bodhicitta where it has not arisen. So there's a common prayer in the Buddhist tradition that comes from Shantideva's way of the Bodhisattva, which says, the precious mind of bodhicitta, may it arise where it has not yet arisen, may it not diminish where it has arisen, but may it increase ever more and more. And so a lot of commentaries to books are even split up into those three topics: the methods for how to generate bodhicitta where it has not yet arisen, the methods for how to sustain it so that it doesn't decline, and the methods for increasing it ever more. And so the 4 immeasurables are considered important in all 3 stages. So when you haven't yet generated bodhicitta, it's important as a method to generate bodhicitta. When you have already generated bodhicitta, it's a way for you to not lose what you've already gained, to kind of stabilize that. And even once you've gained it, it's a way to increase it ever more. So the 4 immeasurables are considered important at all stages. They're not merely a method for generating the aspirational bodhicitta, but they are the main training for generating bodhicitta in the first place. When you don't even have bodhicitta, you have not developed that intention in the first place. It's the main method that we use to develop that. Then the main method for engaged bodhicitta is the 6 perfections. And those 6 perfections are the perfection of generosity, ethical discipline, patience, diligence, which sometimes gets translated as joyful effort. I'll explain why in a moment. Meditative concentration and wisdom. And so tonight we're specifically going to be talking about generosity. And first I want to talk just a moment about what the word perfection or paramita means. So paramita literally means that which takes you to the other side. So it means that, perfection is an interpretive kind of translation, but it's quite common to use that word. In some translations, you'll see the 6 far-reaching practices or far-reaching attitudes or something like that. And often you'll see just paramitas, just left as Sanskrit, because there's so many kind of explanations of the term. A lot of people choose not to translate it and just use the Sanskrit word. But at any rate, what it means is that these 6 practices, when they are, or I should say the first 5 of these 6 practices, when they are joined with wisdom, then they become a method which will take you to the other shore, meaning that they will take you out of samsara, out of a suffering or discontent, unenlightened state, and bring you into the state of enlightenment, the transcendent state, which transcends this current state of suffering and ignorance and so forth. And so that's where this word perfection or paramita comes in, is that right now, for example, if I were to, with my ordinary unenlightened attitude, I were to give $5 to my friend or $100 to my friend who can't make their rent this month or something like that. That is generosity, but that is not the perfection of generosity. So that's where this wisdom aspect comes in. And that's a whole nother topic, which is quite a lot to talk about. And I'm going to briefly mention what that refers to and what that wisdom is. But that is its own topic, which deserves its own 2-hour lecture, which will come in 5 months. But essentially, if you've already done some Buddhist study, it refers to the realization of emptiness. It refers to the kind of realization of the ultimate nature of things. And when we're talking about an act of generosity, what it refers to specifically is, you'll often see this type of terminology in Buddhist texts, which means it is giving without conception of the 3 spheres. This is Buddhist jargon. So don't get too worried about what a sphere is or why it's round or what's the sphere or anything. But anyway, it's kind of 3 aspects. Just think of that. And what that means is that if I were to make that same act of generosity, I were to give my friend some money to cover the rent for the month, I have gotten to a point where I'm no longer fixated on the true existence. I don't believe that I, as a singularly, solidly existing person, is real, like real in the way that I'm grasping it to become some kind of true and solid, ultimately existing thing. I also don't believe that about the object I'm giving, the money, nor do I believe that about the person who I'm giving it to. So I have seen the emptiness or the true reality, the lack of independent existence of me as the giver, the object, which is the gift, as well as the recipient. So one way they'll talk about that is that person in that instance is giving in a dreamlike or illusion-like manner. So let me just tell you a little bit about what the opposite of that would be. If I believe that I'm real, I'm truly, singularly, solidly existing, I believe this money is truly, solidly, singularly existing, and that person is as well, then that whole act of giving is going to be tied up with a lot of grasping, emotion, fixation, potentially ego or regret or attachment or hope for some kind of outcome, like I hope that person's going to be good to me in the future because I did something good for them. You know, there's a lot more attachment, fixation, stickiness in that, because I think I'm real, you're real, this money's real. That's a whole nother topic. And I know that's a lot to hear about right now, just in that short of a statement. But honestly, that topic of the perfection of wisdom and about the topic of emptiness and the lack of independent existence is like a topic that is covered, you know, I mean, for example, it's going to deserve its own full lecture in this instance. And I would also ask either Rachel or Allie to look at the Ewam Garden of a Thousand Buddhas website and copy the link to the video teaching of Khenpo Rinpoche teaching about emptiness into the chat. And I would suggest, if you want to know more about that topic, that you watch that video. It's a 2-hour-ish, hour and a half to 2-hour video of Namchak Rinpoche, who is my teacher and whose picture is auspiciously right above me. This was not planned. Of him teaching about this topic of emptiness extensively and me translating. So that would be a really great way for you to maybe have a more full picture of what that word perfection means. I don't want to overemphasize that too much, though, because for gaining a full context, a full understanding of what this word paramita means, it is important to know. But there's a lot about the practice of generosity and how it works in the Buddhist tradition that we can talk about without having a full understanding of that topic of emptiness. So it's not as if this whole topic is for nothing, or that because you don't understand that one point completely, that this is going to be a waste of your time. Not at all. So, but it is, you know, as a way of framing this whole picture, that is an important part. You know, if we're going to talk about the 6 perfections, obviously we need to talk about why is it called a perfection? What's the point of that? What's the difference between ordinary act of giving and perfection of giving, or the paramita of giving? So that's where that topic comes down to. And so now let's talk just for a moment, as we're still talking about the 6 perfections. I'm just going to go through them briefly just to kind of mention essentially what they're about. And so the first one was generosity. And it sounds obvious. It's just giving, you know. There's a lot more to it, and we're going to cover that topic by topic here in a minute. But essentially, when we're talking about any of these topics, then or any of these 6 perfections, we're talking about methods which are going to help us to get to the state of enlightenment. And the first 5 of those in particular are kind of methods for us to get to the point where we will be able to understand and realize the 6th one of wisdom, which is that realization of emptiness, or the realization of the absence of independent, kind of supposedly true existence. So these first 5, it's not as if you can't practice them without that wisdom of emptiness. You're actually practicing them as methods to get your mind ready to understand emptiness. And once you have understood emptiness, then they become perfections. For now, we're training in them, hoping to perfect them. Ultimately, these 5 practices are going to serve as stepping stones, or I'll think of more of ways of opening doors or opening knots in our mind to open us up to the point that we're ready to understand or realize the state of so-called true reality, emptiness, absence of independent existence. There's many ways of talking about that state. So there's a sequence of these. And the sequence, you know, is when we go from generosity to ethical discipline is much harder to practice than generosity. Like, for example, it's much easier for me to give someone $5, or to give them my time, or to give them a smile, or to give them my attention, or there are other kinds of generosity as well. There's a generosity of protection from fear, like for me to break up a fight or something like that. It's easier for me to do that than it is for me to practice ethical discipline, which in general, just generally speaking, like we would talk about abandoning. There's a category of teachings that are the Buddhist ethics, and the kind of primary, most foundational one when we're talking about the practice of karma and abandoning harmful actions and adopting helpful actions, something called the 10 non-virtues. And They're essentially like sexual misconduct, killing, stealing, lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, harmful intention, covetousness, and wrong view. So anyway, these are like actions which are harmful to yourself and to others. And so for ethical discipline, what that means is to have a sense of restraint within yourself, that I'm not going to do those things. And it's harder to not do those things and to refrain from those than it is to give someone some money or to help someone out or whatever. Likewise, it's harder than refraining from those things. It's even harder to not get angry. And the essence of patience is not getting angry. It's having an undisturbed mind. And so patience in our tradition does not mean being mad, but not letting it out. It doesn't mean biting your tongue and holding it in. It means actually understanding and having an understanding, or having a patience, or having a meditative state, having a fortitude within yourself that you don't get actually angry, that you can not get, even if you feel the energy of the anger, you don't allow it to disturb your mind. And that's the essence of patience. And so patience is even harder to practice than ethical discipline. Likewise, diligence is even harder to practice than that. So, and now coming back around to that word diligence, often you'll see it translated as something like joyful effort or something like that. I personally prefer the word diligence because that's a more literal translation. And the reason why I prefer that word is because at first you see the word diligence and it seems hard. But when you get teachings about that, when you understand what diligence means, it actually means enthusiasm. It means joyful effort. So when you hear that diligence is joyful effort, now diligence doesn't seem so hard anymore. It's just about enthusiasm. So like, if you have enthusiasm, it's easy to do things. Like at first, it might be hard to get up and meditate because you're kind of forcing yourself to do it. But once you get in the flow of it, once you get the taste of it, once it starts to be kind of joyful, you have enthusiasm, it becomes easy. Then the next one is meditative concentration. So even harder than gaining that sense of joyful effort or diligence, it's even harder to keep your mind undistracted. And the essence of meditative concentration is a single-pointed mind, an undistracted mind. And then even harder than that is to develop this wisdom that sees the ultimate nature of reality. And so we can think of it in terms of them being easier or more difficult to train in, also in terms of more coarse or more subtle. So like giving something or protecting someone is a more obvious or outer kind of action than refraining from something. Even more subtle than refraining from something is being able to control yourself and not get angry, and so on and so forth. So the practices become more and more subtle. They also become more and more difficult to train in. But by training in the earlier ones, they prepare you to be able to train in the latter ones. So there's a specific sequence to these. They're not random. And it's not as if you should just train in one and not the rest until you've perfected generosity, that you shouldn't practice discipline or whatever. We practice all of them, but there is a sequence in that in difficulty. They start off easier and become more difficult, and they start off more obvious and become more subtle. And so there's another way that we talk about the six perfections, in that, like, in a simple manner, like right now, we could fulfill all of the six perfections in this one act of you listening to me talk about the six perfections. So like, for example, generosity. Generosity is you've given up your time to be here. You are giving your attention to these teachings. Ethical discipline is you're maybe putting down your phone, sacrificing like other things, refraining from other kinds of like maybe distracting and so forth actions, or and kind of refraining from those things in order to be here. Patience, it may be a long session. You might have sore knees or a sore back, but anyway, you have the fortitude and the forbearance to be here and be present. Diligence, you come here with some kind of enthusiasm or some kind of interest. Meditative concentration is focusing on the topic at hand and not getting totally distracted by other thoughts or other things in your periphery or whatever. And wisdom, so wisdom from one perspective, on the highest level, wisdom is this realization of the ultimate reality. On an ordinary level, the way that we talk about this term wisdom, which is better translated as profound intelligence, It often just gets thrown around as wisdom, but wisdom, in a Western sense, is more of an accumulated knowledge that makes you be able to make good decisions or something like that. And that's not what it means at all in Buddhism, actually. In Buddhism, it is a very sharp discernment, a very sharp intelligence, which knows this from that. So, so in this sense, listening to the teachings, thinking critically about them, and becoming more clear about what these topics are, knowing this is this and that's that, is the aspect of wisdom. So in that, just even in this one action of sitting and listening to this teaching, the 6 perfections are complete within that. And you can similarly apply that same presentation for almost any activity that you engage in. And so it's not, my point in bringing that up is that the 6 perfections aren't necessarily some specific thing that you have to think about doing, but that they are the way that you carry yourself in a certain situation. And so there is more to it than that. For example, we're going to talk about specific types of generosity, specific ways of giving, and so forth. There also, when we talk about ethical discipline, within ethical discipline, as a traditional practitioner of Buddhism, there are particular vows that could be taken, like people take a refuge vow. That is kind of a commitment towards certain practices, a commitment towards refraining from certain harmful actions and so forth. There's something called bodhisattva vows. There's something called tantric samaya or tantric vows. Those are all particular aspects of ethical discipline. It could also just be you for yourself. If you're not a traditional Buddhist practitioner, you're just kind of curious. It is, people have their own sense of ethics, whether that is secular or religiously inspired. So kind of keeping and maintaining that is an aspect of ethical discipline. And so all of these things, can be practiced in just day-to-day life. They're not necessarily something that you have to think of as like some kind of like special spiritual thing. It's really just there are obviously things that you can focus in on, that you can try to improve your practice of, or that you can try and refine your understanding of and your practice of. But they're not some far off thing. They're very tangible. They're very applicable to our day-to-day life. And so let's come around to coming back to this idea of the perfection of wisdom and how that perfection of wisdom makes the other 5 perfections. And so there's a quote from one of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. So that is the Paramita. We call that the Paramita Sutras. There are a lot of those. So in translation, there's like the Heart Sutra is the most famous of those sutras. It is the most condensed of the Paramita Sutras, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And that is the sutra which that video that Rachel or Ali put into the chat, that is the topic of that video. And so there are more and more of those Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. There's a very shorter one, there's longer ones, there's the Perfection of Wisdom in 300 lines, Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines, Perfection of Wisdom in 20,000 lines, the Perfection of Wisdom in 100,000 lines, which is like a giant few volumes of text. Anyway, all of those are talking about the topic of emptiness. And in one of the most brief versions of that, there's a quote that says, "Without a guide, how could even 1 trillion blind people who are unfamiliar with the road ever find the city gate? Without wisdom, the 5 perfections are sightless. Without its guidance, one cannot reach enlightenment." And so as a method for enlightenment, these 5 practices, the first 5 practices, are not going to get you to enlightenment on their own without wisdom. They might make you a better person. They might make you a more respectable person, a more aware person, a person with much better focus, who can do their job a lot better, who might be more kind to the people around them, more generous, more patient, and so forth. But those things, without the insight into the nature of reality, which is the perfection of wisdom, will not get you enlightened. So coming back around, just to reframe this, all of this whole topic of the 6 perfections is talked about within this scope of the practice of bodhicitta. And the practice of bodhicitta is the intention to attain the state of enlightenment for yourself and all beings, or to bring other beings to the state of enlightenment. So all of this is talked about within this perspective of a quest for enlightenment. They're not just some like, it would be good to be generous, or it would be good to be, ethically restrained or whatever. It is, if you want to get enlightened, you should follow these kinds of steps. You should implement these kinds of practices. So that's the whole, just to reframe things and bring us back around. Just want to make sure that's clear. So, and in that, it's not as if wisdom alone will work either. So I said, without wisdom, those 5 won't get you enlightened, but wisdom without those 5 also won't get you enlightened. That's a problem. And so that requires a little bit of a description of what we mean by enlightened. And so in Mahayana Buddhism, it's a little bit different than what they talk about in Theravada Buddhism. So I don't want to get into too much hullabaloo about the differences and all of that kind of stuff, but without talking about it, it's tricky, because Mahayana Buddhism often talks about something that they call non-abiding nirvana. What does that mean? That means not remaining in samsara, but also not remaining in nirvana. And so that requires a bit of like clarification, because it seems like, on first glance, the enlightenment and nirvana are the same thing, or the whole point of this path is to attain nirvana, which is the freedom of suffering or whatever. But there's a little bit of a very fine difference or distinction that needs to be made there, which is that in the Theravada Buddhist texts, when they talk about their attainment of nirvana, they talk about it literally like suffering ends, but when suffering ends, it's kind of like your consciousness. Imagine that your consciousness is a candle that's burning. You blew the candle out. That's exactly what it says, is the description of it. It's kind of like, this only makes sense in the context of a past and future lives worldview. So let's say that you accept that you have had this stream of consciousness, which has been spinning in this cycle of death and rebirth and suffering for countless eons. And your goal is to escape the cycle. The only way, killing yourself doesn't do anything, because you'll just take rebirth. You'll just be reborn again in a much worse situation because of the karmic repercussions of killing yourself. So the only way to escape the cycle is by attaining nirvana in the Theravada tradition. And in the Theravada tradition, that means to have a direct realization of your own individual selflessness, which means that your self-identity, the I or me, doesn't truly exist. And they say that when you have the ultimate level of realization of that, it's like the candle representing your stream of consciousness that's been passing through infinite lifetimes goes out. So there's no more rebirth. Now, Mahayana Buddhism says that is a selfish, one-sided attainment of peace, which doesn't help anyone. And so they say that the enlightenment of a Buddha, a fully enlightened Buddha, because in Theravada Buddhism, they say you can't even become a Buddha. They say Buddha's Buddha and you're an ordinary person. You can only attain this state of, they have a special term for it, they call it arhat. It doesn't really matter, let's not get into that. But it's a state of high realization, the full realization of the selflessness, individual selflessness that ends your continuity in samsara. But that's not a Buddha. A Buddha is a fully enlightened being who continues working for the benefit of others. And so even though they have attained enlightenment, they're not abiding in this single-sided like cessation state, which is a cessation of their activities and their consciousness and so forth. So what it said is that a Buddha, because of their realization of emptiness, their realization of the absence of independent existence, they no longer abide in samsara. But because of their compassion, they also don't abide in that single-sided state of peace, which we would call nirvana. So that means, that's why they call it non-abiding nirvana. It is the state which neither abides in samsara, because they're no longer suffering, because they have attained that full realization, which a realization of emptiness of both oneself and of all phenomena, which means that they're no longer experiencing suffering. They no longer are in that continuity of samsara, but they don't just fall into a state of absence or cessation, because the power of their great compassion leads them to continue working for the welfare of others. And so that's what's meant by, and where this comes in with needing both the methods and the wisdom. So the first 5 of the perfections are talked about as the methods and the sixth is wisdom. And so you need both, essentially. If you only want to get a single-sided state of peace, you only need the realization of selflessness. You don't need all these other practices. But if you want to attain Buddhahood for the sake of all beings, if you want to fulfill this practice of bodhicitta, if you want to fulfill your aspiration of bodhicitta by doing these engaged practices and fully manifesting that result, then you need the methods and the wisdom. And so, and the methods are, you can think of those as aspects of compassion. They are kind of a manifestation, or you could say an aspect of this side of method, which is associated with compassion, as opposed to the side of wisdom, which is that insight into the nature of reality. So together, when you bring all those aspects together, the five perfections of method with the sixth perfection of wisdom, then you can attain the state of a Buddha, which is that non-abiding nirvana. So all of that, sorry, that took almost 35 minutes or something. That was just to even frame the conversation about the perfection of generosity, because I knew if I just started talking about the perfection of generosity, there's no context. So for some of you who are already been studying these things for many years, you would know what I was talking about, and many other people, there's no foundation to even have the conversation. So sorry that took so long, and I hope that was clear, and we'll have plenty of time for questions later. So please write down questions, and we can, even if you just think that what I'm talking about is crazy nonsense, please just let me know that you think it's crazy nonsense. We can have a discussion. So really, nothing is off limits here. We can talk about anything. So one more thing about this will be something that applies to all of the perfections. They have 4 essential characteristics. So one is that they will diminish the strength of their contrary factor. What that means is that by practicing generosity, it's going to weaken the strength of your greediness, your covetousness. By practicing ethical discipline, it will break away, or it will decline or diminish the strength of your haphazardness, your kind of like wild, unrestrained conduct. Patience, it will weaken the strength of your anger. Diligence will weaken the strength of your laziness. Meditative concentration will weaken the strength of your distraction. Wisdom will weaken the strength of your ignorance, like that. And so the next is that they will bring you to a state of non-conceptual timeless awareness. This is more like lofty lingo for they will bring you to the realization, direct realization of reality, or they will lead you to have this full understanding of that lack of independent existence, the perfection of wisdom. The next is they will fulfill all wishes perfectly. So essentially by doing all of these practices, they're going to fulfill the wishes of you and others. So if you're doing them in the way that they are prescribed, like basically they're going to, if you are a person who is practicing proper ethical restraint and patience and enthusiasm and all these kind of things, then you're going to be a much more like helpful person in the world. It's also going to, for example, you're going to encounter a lot less problems for yourself and others. Like you're not going to be creating problems for yourself and others. If you are practicing with ethical restraint, you're practicing with compassion, you're being generous, you're going to gather a lot more of a support network. A lot more people are going to want to help you, and you're going to be creating a lot less enemies and a lot less problems for yourself, even in your own head. Like if you're cheating on your partner, if you're lying to people, this is all creating a whole world, a whole web of suspicion and doubt and regret and all kinds of negative emotions in your mind. And so basically, it says the line literally just says fulfills all wishes perfectly, but basically essentially what that means is it's going to make you a better vessel for accomplishing your own happiness and the happiness of other people. And the last is it brings beings to spiritual maturity. And so what that means is that by you going through those practices and developing yourself, you're going to be a more capable person for helping others to mature themselves on some kind of spiritual path. And so if you're practicing something and you like think that it is a perfection, or you're trying to practice the perfection of generosity, it should be doing those things. If your generosity is not contributing to the weakening of your greediness or your covetousness or your miserliness, then there's something missing. You should re-examine the way you're practicing, something like that. So now to get on to generosity itself. So generosity can be talked about in 2 ways. in the traditional like Buddhist way. One is, giving to others who need something. In that can be in a few different ways. And another one is making offerings to someone who you think of as like holy or high. Like we make offerings to, I make offering to my teacher, or I make offerings in terms of like some symbolic offerings of water bowls in front of my statues of the Buddha and in front of my pictures of my teacher every morning. That's another aspect of the perfection of generosity. And so one thing is that I'm gonna be talking about this from a presentation which is found in some of our traditional texts. It's a text called what's the English title? One second. The Ornament of Precious Liberation. And I'm also going to be talking from a book that is called The Guide to the Words of My Perfect Teacher, and another book which is called The Treasury of Precious Qualities. And so I just say that just to say that I'm not just pulling this stuff out of thin air, and I'm not making things up. I'm following an actual traditional kind of outline of topics on this, and obviously trying to riff on that a little bit just to make it a little bit more workable, or a little bit more maybe contextual. Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Okay, and so the first kind of topic in these teachings on generosity is the drawbacks of its absence. And so if you don't have a practice of generosity, or if you are not able to practice generously, then now, once again, this is coming from the traditional side, and you may or may not even believe in this kind of stuff, but in terms of a multi-lifetime type of situation, the karmic effect of covetousness or greediness is that you'll be reborn in the future in a state they call as a hungry ghost. So you don't even believe in that, but you still believe in reincarnation. Maybe you believe that you'd be reborn as a human. They would say that the karmic effect of that is that you'll be reborn impoverished. But in this lifetime, we can even see that the effects of miserliness or covetousness is that it pushes people away. It makes you less likable. It doesn't develop community. There are a lot of negative effects that we can even see in our ordinary experience. Another one of them is that another one of those downfalls that they say is that without some kind of generosity, without being giving of, and this, don't think of giving only as money. Remember this. There's other topics about giving here. Is that without generosity, you can't gather people around you. You're going to be very isolated and alone. And when you're isolated and alone, even if you're on some spiritual quest or spiritual journey, it's not going to help anyone but you. So that's another aspect of this. So the potential benefit that you could bring to the world is very limited if you are very greedy, miserly, if you're not able to share what you have with others. So now coming into this, we talk about the three kinds of generosity. So one is material generosity. That seems like the most obvious one. The second is the gift of fearlessness. And the third is the gift of the Dharma. So we'll start off with material, because that's the most kind of obvious. And so in this practice of the perfection of generosity, it said that you should give with the intention, they call it the superior intention or the best of intentions. It's just a nickname for bodhicitta. So when you give something, you should be giving it with the wish for that person that you're giving to be freed from suffering and to attain the state of enlightenment. And you should give joyfully. And what that means is you should give enthusiastically. You shouldn't regret. You shouldn't be like paining yourself to give them something. You should actually give it to them enthusiastically and joyfully. You should give it respectfully. So you shouldn't give it with a sense of condescension to the other person. Like, oh, I'm in this like lofty position and you're down there. Oh, I guess I'll give you something. It's not, you should give it to them with respect to that person, to their dignity. And this one's a little bit, maybe it was contextual to the old days, but it can be applicable, I think, in modern times too. And, in the traditional text, it says to give in person. And so I think that in certain contexts that can make sense in terms of fostering connections, and especially if it's between you and someone you know. But there are a lot of circumstances where like material generosity is done through third parties. We give to a homeless shelter. We give to someone who's doing relief work after a natural disaster, like the earthquake in Turkey or any other kind of situations in the world to benefit people in Ukraine or whatever the situation may be. So, I think that like you can kind of think about that if it applies, if you think it's more helpful to do it in person, if it is like a situation of someone you actually know, and it is somehow like fostering better relations or healing relations or whatever. But anyway, I don't know the exact intention and how that plays out, because I think in modern day, a lot of our acts of generosity for many people are done through intermediaries, third parties, nonprofits, that kind of thing, NGOs, whatever. And so the next is giving at the right time. And so that is one of those things that, is also very contextual, and it's very much up to you and seeing when the need arises, that it may or may not be applicable. It may or may not be helpful if you give something at the wrong time. And so that's not something I can say, do it this way or that way. It's just that gifts should be timely. And another is that you should give without harming others. And what that can mean is that, let's say I have a family, let's say I'm married and I have kids, and we have a household budget and we need to keep within that budget. We need to save for our kids' school. But I, without talking to my partner, just give $50,000 to someone or to whatever, to help some nonprofit or to the temple or to whatever. That is a gift that is harming others. And that was a non-consensual gift. There's a lot of problems with that. So there are kind of right and wrong ways to give materially. So that's just another kind of, side point to that. Then we can talk about the motivations for giving. So the improper motivations for giving are wanting to be famous or wanting people to think that you're a good person, wanting some kind of reward. Like if I give, then I'm going to get something back. If I give out of competition, like someone else gave $500, well, I'll give $700. So basically the point of that is that coming back around to the whole point of this giving, I mean, not to say that it's not to help others, it's obviously to help others, but it's also to serve as an antidote to your covetousness. And if your giving is just creating or increasing the power of your other afflictive emotions, then there's something wrong there. And so that's why we need to examine our motivation. And that's why we come back around to the correct motivation was the motivation to liberate beings from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. Even if you're not on board with that full picture of bodhicitta and you just think generosity is a good thing, I think that you could also understand that you give with the pure intention to help the other and without a wish for some personal reward. And so another problem with giving with some expectation of a reward is that it's often the case that you give something to someone and then you find out later that they used it for something else, or they used it in a way that you didn't want them to, or they use it in a way that maybe didn't bring about the result that you were expecting. And then I know that this is tricky and that you want people to do the things that they say they're going to do, but it's only hurting you to not give without any, when you give in this context, especially, you have to, sorry, there's a beeping here. There's another camera that just turned off. Don't worry about it. If you give with no sense of any reward, no sense of any future outcome, you just give purely, then your gift is perfect. It is pure. Your intention was pure when you gave it. The giving was pure. Whatever happens. I'm done. I did it. If you follow through, you follow through. If you don't, you don't. Otherwise, if you're giving with an expectation of a particular result or a reward and you don't get it, you're later going to regret the fact that you ever gave in the first place. And that is corrupting all of whatever kind of goodness, whatever kind of virtue, whatever kind of antidote to your covetousness might have been effectively functioning when you first gave the gift is all destroyed when you start regretting the whole action because the outcome wasn't what you wanted. And so that's another real key point in this Buddhist practice of generosity, is to give with the pure intention and to give without any expectation whatsoever about a future outcome. So another improper motivation is the motivation of, and this is also going back to this multi-lifetime perspective, is that in the teachings on karma, it said that if you are generous, that in the future you'll be reborn in a wealthy situation. You'll be reborn as a human and a human with wealth. And so that's another improper motivation, like, oh, I'm only giving because in the texts or on the teachings on karma, it says that I'll be rich in the future. So that's another improper motivation. The motivation should always be the intention to liberate others from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. So now we can talk about improper gifts. So still we're in the world of material generosity. Improper gifts are things that have been stolen. Similarly, like before, if you have shared property and you have not had a discussion with the people who you've shared it with, that's misappropriated, or anyway, improperly used. Things that are stolen, you shouldn't give. Things that can harm others, like a gift of poison, a gift of weapons, and so forth, is considered an improper gift in this context. So, yeah. Another way of improper giving is that if you're really wealthy and you only give a very small gift, that's considered improper. Like, let's say you're a millionaire, billionaire, whatever, and someone's having a really hard time and you give them $1. That's almost condescending, even just in a worldly sense. Forget about Dharma. But if you're really trying to think about it as an antidote to your covetousness, and you're extraordinarily wealthy and you give someone $1, that's not doing anything to your greed or your covetousness. So anyway, just remember when you're coming back around and you're hearing about improper, think about what's the primary motivation. The motivation is to free sentient beings from suffering and to bring them to enlightenment. And the other main point is that it should serve as an antidote to your miserliness, your covetousness, your greed. And so in all of these kind of circumstances, if you refer back to those main points, then a lot of this makes a lot more sense. Another one is the manner in which you give. So you shouldn't give in anger. As we said before, you shouldn't give with contempt or with a sense of looking down upon the other person, but you should give with respect to them, with upholding their dignity and so forth. So that concludes the section on material gifts. And now we have the gift of freedom from fear. And that one's really simple. There's not much to it. And in the traditional texts, they don't even explain it very much. They basically just say that means, to protect beings, not just humans, any beings from robbers, thieves, beasts of prey. Like if a dog were attacking a cat, you'd like scare the dog off or something like that, illnesses, natural disasters, and so forth. So like with illnesses, it's very obvious in our current environment. We've just gone through a pandemic. If you're feeling a little bit sick and you still have to go outside, wear a mask. That's protecting others. That's just common sense, but also in the sense of this practice, that is literally protecting others. From robbers and thieves, maybe it's not so easy for us to actually do those things, but if we were in a circumstance, we saw someone grab someone's purse or pick up someone's wallet, say something, do something, that's protection from fear. So that's about all it really talks about in the traditional text, and we don't really need to go into it more than that. But the next one, which is a bigger topic, it's not as big as material gifts, but is the gift of Dharma. And so once again, we have some categories to this, and the first one is the person who you're talking to. And so this is a really important one, because the first parts about that is that you have to be talking to someone who even wants to hear about it. It's often the case that people who get overly enthusiastic about their spiritual path, they want to just talk about it to everyone. And there are a lot of people who just don't want to hear about it. And there are times when it might be appropriate, and there are times when it might be inappropriate to try and bring this stuff up with them. It might literally cause them to disrespect and to dislike it even more. And if you're thinking about that karmically, that is distancing them from these teachings for even longer. Like if you think about this infinite lives, infinite beings, I'm going to free infinite beings, and over the course of infinite lifetimes, there's a lot of this kind of talk in Mahayana Buddhism. And if you actually believe that, then you shouldn't do things which are going to make people not like the Dharma, because that is going to potentially cause them 5, 10, hundreds of lifetimes more to ever contact the Dharma in a way that's helpful for them. I know that's like a far out topic and like maybe just sounds bizarre or stupid or ridiculous to some of you. But if you believe in karma, those are things that you should think about seriously. If you believe in this kind of idea of infinite lifetimes and at some point everyone will become enlightened, all this kind of talk, you hear about this stuff in Mahayana Buddhism. And if you believe in that, then you should think about the way that your interactions are reflecting on the Dharma to other people. And so basically, to come back around, that was a lot of talk to just say that when you're teaching the Dharma, you should be teaching to someone that actually wants to hear about it. And so that person should have respect for these kind of teachings and should have some respect for you as someone who might have some authority to talk about those teachings. Second is the motivation. It's kind of the same as before, without wish for fame or honor or rewards or money or any kind of, you don't want to become like, I'm not sitting here talking to you all about this because I want my name on some advertisements and my picture in some book and I don't know, whatever. It's not because I'm trying to gather students and I'm not trying to become famous and I'm not trying to get paid a lot of money. I'm just doing this because I think this could be helpful for you. You all are interested. We as an organization presented the idea of these teachings. People responded favorably. I said, okay, I'll come talk about it. So, that's the whole point. And so often you'll hear, if you ever come to teachings with Ken Rinpoche, he always is reiterating this kind of stuff. He's one of my main teachers. And he's always saying, I'm just here because I think that this might be helpful for you. I'm not getting paid any amount of money. I'm not getting famous from this. I don't care about any of that. I just hope that this could be helpful for you, give you some more understanding of the Dharma, maybe lead you another step in your spiritual path. And so that is the motivation. Third is giving authentic Dharma. And what that means is that you should be able to teach these materials in a way that accords with the original intention of these teachings, like in accordance with the intention of the Buddha in his sutras and the main Buddhist teachings, and in the authentic commentaries of all of the great masters of our tradition. And so that's up to you to decide. Do you have those skills? Do you have those kind of qualifications? In certain circumstances, that is a matter of a person's teacher giving them authorization of sorts. Now you can teach this or that topic. I would go so far as to say that if you encounter some spiritual teachers who never refer back to any classical text, authoritative text, never talk about their teachers, I would run away fast, especially in the Buddhist tradition. Lineage is extremely important. Having heard the teachings from someone else who actually had heard them from someone else, there's a living tradition. This isn't like some dead thing found in some books that we found on the side of the road. There's a living tradition of experience, of wisdom, of enlightenment, going all the way back to the Buddha in an unceasing stream. And so, I'm not saying I have all these great qualities, but anyway, I have the confidence to talk about this topic in a way that I think is in accordance with what the Buddha said. And I don't mean to make this about me, but it's pertinent to the topic right now. And so basically that just means that it's maybe not a good idea if you only have a very vague understanding of certain Buddhist topics, just start telling other people how to live their lives in accordance with those types of teachings. That doesn't mean don't have discussions about them. It doesn't mean don't have lively Dharma discussions with your friends and share these ideas or discuss them with other people you think might be interested in philosophy. But to try to tell other people how to live their lives in accordance with these things requires a certain amount of education, experience, and so forth. So that's what giving authentic Dharma refers to. Fourth is a funny one. Well, it's not funny. I'll just say that it can be funny. So what it says literally is don't accept to teach right away. And so there's a tradition sometimes in Buddhism of saying, someone asks you to teach something, you say, no, I don't know anything about that, even if you do. No, how could I ever teach about that? I'm just an idiot. I'm just like some lowly, basic, I read a couple books, but how could I ever teach about that? But another aspect of that is that the teacher, before they accept to teach a student, especially about some more profound topics, should also examine the students to see if they are a suitable candidate for those teachings. In the current context, it's not that applicable because this is a very general teaching. nothing that we're talking about tonight is like secret, or not that there's that much that's secret in Buddhism, but there are some teachings, like, for example, like Ken Rinpoche doesn't like to teach about meditation on emptiness to people who aren't more committed to a Buddhist path, because if you don't understand emptiness well, you can fall into a view of nihilism, and it can become kind of depressing and dark and heavy if you don't have the support of the rest of the path. It's like, it's similar to what I said before, that experience or that practice of the perfection of wisdom needs to be accompanied by all these other aspects of generosity and discipline and practices involving developing loving kindness and compassion, and all. There's a complete path that supports and nurtures that experience of practicing emptiness. And so there are certain teachings that, like, before Ken Rinpoche would want to teach someone to meditate on emptiness, he would want to make sure that they have kind of prepared and kind of primed themselves for that type of experience. And so there are certain contexts, right now, this is a very general topic, very general teaching. Anyone could listen to this and it could be helpful for them. And I don't think any harm could come of it. But there are some teachings in the more like profound and deeper levels of Buddhism where it would require some kind of authorization, some kind of the teacher checking and discussing things with a student to make sure that they're at a level that they're ready to approach that type of teaching. So anyway, that's part of that aspect of not accepting to teach right away. It means that there needs to be some kind of appropriate subject matter. Just because a student comes like to Ken Rinpoche and says, I want the highest teaching, I want the tantric yoga, whatever, that he's obviously needs to check out who you are and what your practice history is, who your teachers are, what you've done. And if you've done the work and everything's appropriate, then yeah, in our lineage, they'll teach, they're not hiding anything from the West. It's not like, oh, it's our secret Tibetan stuff. Our teachers will give any teaching to any student as long as they have done the work and done the preparations and done the required practices that get you to that point. So that's part of that point, is that that someone shouldn't just teach just because someone asked them to, but there's more to it than that. Basically, there is a bit of a teacher checking the suitability of the student. And in some traditional ways, there's this kind of show of humility, like, oh, how could I ever teach that? I don't know anything about that kind of thing. That's, it still happens, but oftentimes, because Tibetans know that we Westerners don't understand some of their, not just Tibetans, it's Indians as well, it's coming back from the Indian tradition. Sometimes if they say no, we just think no. And we don't understand that they're just being humble and we need to insist, So it's funny cultural stuff. So a lot of Tibetan teachers, if you request and they think it's okay, they'll just say, sure. They're not going to say, no, I don't know anything about that, So anyway, sorry, that was a little bit of a sidetrack. So that covers all the main topics on the practice of the perfection of generosity. And so one thing that is talked about is that there are certain practices, like actual like meditations, that people practice. And so they say that in your kind of meditation, you imagine giving everything to benefit sentient beings. And they talk about three main things, that everything's covered in these three things. I'll give my body, my possessions, and all my roots of virtue. Those are the things that are talked about in traditional practices. And so basically that covers everything. Like everything that you could have ever had or possessed is covered in that. And so you imagine, this is just an imaginary practice, a mental practice to familiarize yourself with letting go of things and not being attached to everything. And remember, the whole point of, not the whole point, the main point of this is to overcome your covetousness, meaning to overcome your attachment to possessions, to your body, to all these kind of things. So you would imagine that, okay, if it is helpful for the enlightenment of others, for the freedom of suffering of others, I will give up everything, my body, all of my roots of virtue, all my possessions. That doesn't mean you actually do that in your life. It's kind of a mental training. And I'm not telling you to do this practice right now. There are practices which do this. And this is an aspect of some Buddhist practices. So I'm just letting you know, this is a way that this is practiced. Not that you should sit down and think about giving everything away right now. There are a lot of practices that do this. And so it's a kind of a mental giving, a mental act of giving. And then, in terms of application in your day-to-day life, you practice these kind of aspects of the gift giving, material things, giving protection from fear, and giving the Dharma. And one other key point that I didn't come back to with giving material gifts is that it was kind of covered by the general topic, but one of the main things is that you give according to your own kind of capacity. And that means not only your financial capacity, but also like where you're at, like what hurts, like if it seems like nothing to give something, then that comes back to the rich person example, like a billionaire that gives $1. It should hurt a little bit, like if you're like, okay, I'm going to give some money to the local shelter or whatever, the food pantry, whatever the case may be, or even just to like your local trail organization or anyone, whoever you're giving to. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone who's destitute or whatever, but you have $50, but that's like, I'm just thinking like, not necessarily for myself, but like, if that is just like, whatever, maybe give a little more, it should hurt a little bit, because that hurt a little bit means that that's the sparking of your covetousness. And so your practice should go against your covetousness is the point. And so, in the notes to the Words of My Perfect Teacher, Khenpo Ngakchung, who is the author of that book, he says like, when you're acting, when you're doing things, so like a lot of this is just kind of like a general description of like the practice of generosity, right? There's different subtopics, there's ways to do it. Now, Khenpo Ngakchung says, when you're actually doing it and you're about to give something and you feel that pain of like miserliness, in that moment, remember the downfalls of miserliness, remember the benefits of giving, the how it will help to diminish your covetousness, how it will help to ripen beings, to bring them on the spiritual path, all this kind of stuff. And then use that as an antidote to overcome your miserliness, to follow through with whatever the act of generosity may be, whether that is financial, whether that is giving your time, whether that is sharing the Dharma, whether that is overcoming your kind of inability to act when you could actually help protect someone, whatever the case may be, to actually recall that sense of the faults of covetousness and the benefits of generosity, to be able to step through that. And so, what that shows us is that, to a certain extent, is that if it's not hard to do, it's probably not acting as an antidote to your covetousness. So then the final topic is just a general topic that's covered in almost every Mahayana Buddhist practice, which is the dedication of merit. And so when we talk about that, what we mean is that, when you've done anything good, there's a certain sense of like, I did something good, and in Buddhism, we call that a virtue, or sometimes they use the word roots of virtue, or a merit or meritorious deed. And it's talked about as like something that you have, because it's something that we hold on to. We kind of almost identify with it. Like, I'm a good person because I did a good thing. And, it's like something we try and collect, almost like a tally sheet of all the good deeds we did that we could maybe like feel good about ourselves with, or something like that, And I don't mean that in a condescending way, but I think we really do that to a certain extent. We identify with the good deeds we've done. And there is a practice in Buddhism called dedication of merit. And what that means is we imagine all of these, imaginary kind of like virtues or positive results of all the good things we did. And we imagine that we give those away as well to the benefit of all sentient beings, so that they could be freed from suffering and attain the state of enlightenment. So we are trying to like uproot everything that we could hold on to reinforce our ego, to reinforce our pride, and we're giving it away as a cause for the liberation and freedom of all beings. And so that's the essence of dedication. And it's said that, when you, like, let's say in this act of generosity, but you can apply this to any of the 6 perfections or any virtuous or wholesome or helpful action, when you dedicate that, when you give it away, it says that it increases the power of that virtuous practice. It makes it immeasurable. And it also makes it inexhaustible. And what that means is that there's another teaching. I'm not going to get into this right now, but there's a teaching called the 4 causes for the extinction of your virtue, or the diminishment of your virtue. And one of them is regretting that you did something. So let's say you do something positive, something helpful, you donate some money, you help your friend move, whatever the case may be. Then that person does something bad to you, or they do something that makes you ashamed of yourself or ashamed of them. And now you regret that you ever helped them in the first place. That destroys any virtuous thing that you ever did in the first place, because that virtue is something that is kind of, it's something that if you don't dedicate it, if you don't give it away, if you don't if you're still trying to hold on to it for yourself, and then later you get upset or you regret it, it's gone. That good feeling, that good vibe, that wholesomeness is gone. It's destroyed by your anger, by your regret. There's 4 causes. And so right now, coming to mind without looking at a text, I remember 2 of them. One is anger and one is regret. And so when it says that dedication makes your virtues inexhaustible, it means that you're no longer trying to hold on to it for yourself. You've already given it away to the benefit of all beings. So later, even if you regretted that action, it's kind of like that wholesomeness, that virtue is already in the bank. It's not going anywhere. And it's just like they say, it's like a drop in the ocean of the pool that is going to kind of a way that they talk about this. Sorry, this is more Buddhist jargon, and I hate to throw Buddhist jargon out, but in a certain sense, that's what I'm trained in. And so I'm interpreting Buddhist jargon into modern colloquial English to try and make this make more sense to you guys. So I'm sorry if sometimes it sounds a little tedious. But they use these words called the 2 accumulations. And so one is called the accumulation of merit. And what that means is that all of these ordinary virtuous activities, like any of the first 5 of the 6 perfections, any act of generosity, any act of restraint from negativity, those kind of things are kind of building the power of merit. And what that means is it's kind of like the supportive conditions. It's like a fertile field. You're tilling and fertilizing a field in which your enlightenment could blossom. And so, sometimes it's talked about drops of water, when they say that when you take a single drop of water and put it into the ocean, that drop of water doesn't diminish until the entire ocean diminishes, because it's now mixed with the entirety of the ocean. And so that's the example that they give for when you dedicate merit. When you've dedicated the merit, when you've given it away, it will remain until as a support for your attainment of enlightenment until you attain enlightenment. It's going to continue to be a nurturing, supportive condition for your spiritual path. But if you don't dedicate it and you try and hold it for yourself, it can be destroyed very easily by regret, by anger, by these other conditions. So, those are the main points. Then the way that generosity can be made utterly pure is coming back to the idea of perfection, or paramita, which means that when it's combined with the view or the understanding of emptiness and with the kind of motivating factor of bodhicitta or compassion, then that creates a situation where your actions of these first 5 paramitas, or particularly in this context, generosity, will serve as a cause for you to attain the non-abiding enlightenment. Non-abiding meaning, once again, because it's combined with compassion, you won't fall into that single-sided piece of the Theravada idea of nirvana, which means a cessation, basically just a cutting off of your consciousness, a cutting off of your cycle of samsara. So because of compassion, you won't remain in that, but you'll continue working for others. But you will also not be still stuck in the cycle of suffering, because you have the realization of emptiness. So when your practice of generosity is combined with compassion and emptiness, it serves as a direct cause of your enlightenment. Without the idea of emptiness and compassion, generosity, specifically, karmically speaking, serves as a cause for wealth and for fortunate rebirth in the future, that kind of thing. When it's combined with emptiness and compassion, it becomes utterly pure, meaning that it's no longer a cause of samsara. So it's no longer a cause of, even if it's fortunate, a fortunate rebirth, like being reborn as a human with wealth and resources, that's still within the state of suffering, within the state of discontent of samsara. And so generosity alone, without the view of emptiness and compassion, is still going to be a cause, whether that is a fortunate outcome or not, of continued existence in samsara. When it's combined with emptiness and compassion, then that means that that practice of generosity will become a cause of enlightenment and no longer become a cause of samsaric existence. So that is, everything that I had, like my whole outline, all my notes and all the things I wanted to talk about.